Hello, my dear children. Myself Sujata. Today we learn a new chapter from Politics, Chapter 2 Constitutional Design. Okay, let us see which are the topics to be covered. We'll discuss about why do we need a constitution, making of the Indian Constitution, the path to constitution, the Constituent Assembly, guiding values of the Indian Constitution, philosophy of the Constitution, and institutional design. Okay, now let us have an overview of the topic. In the previous chapter, we learned that in a democracy, the rulers are not free to do what they like. There are certain basic rules that the citizens and the government have to follow. All such rules together are called constitution. As the supreme law of the country, the constitution determines the rights of citizens, the powers of the government, and how the government should function. The South African example is a good way to understand why we need a constitution and what do constitutions do. As you all know, democratic constitution in South Africa is deleted from the portion and you don't want to learn it in detail. But to understand why we need a constitution, we have to consider this as an example. So let us have an idea regarding what has happened in South Africa. In South Africa, apartheid was a system of racial discrimination imposed by white Europeans on South Africa. Skin color was made the basis of discrimination. 3/4 of the population were blacks. Besides white and black, there were people of mixed races who migrated from India and were called colored. White minority formed the government and followed the policy of apartheid. Blacks and colored had no voting rights. They had separate schools, hotels, beaches, and no right to form associations or even to protest. African National Congress led the struggle against this kind of segregation. Nelson Mandela and 7 other leaders were sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964 for daring to oppose the apartheid regime in his country, and spent next 28 years in the most dreaded prison, the Robben Island. Many struggles and protests made the white regime unstable. Policies changed, laws repealed, and restrictions on media were lifted. Finally, at the midnight of 26 April 1994, the new national flag of the Republic of South Africa was unfurled. It marked the newly born democracy in the world. The oppressor and the oppressed in the new democracy were planning to live together as equals. It was not going to be easy for them to trust each other. They had the fears. They wanted to safeguard their interest. The black majority was keen to ensure that the democratic principle of majority rule was not compromised. They wanted substantial social and economic rights. The white minority was keen to protect its privileges and property. After long negotiations, both parties agreed to a compromise. The whites agreed to the principle of majority rule and that of one person, one vote. They also agreed to accept some basic rights for the poor and the workers. The blacks agreed that majority rule would not be absolute. They agreed that the majority would not take away the property of the white minority. This compromise was not easy. The only way to build and maintain trust in such a situation was to write down some rules of the game that everyone would abide by. These rules lay down how the rulers are to be chosen in future. These rules also determine what the elected governments are empowered to do and what they cannot. Finally, these rules decide the rights of the citizens. These rules will work only if the winner cannot change them very easily. This is what the South Africans did. They agreed on some basic rules. They also agreed that these rules will be supreme, that no government will be able to ignore these. This set of basic rules is called a constitution. Okay, why do we need a constitution? You know that the constitution of a country is a set of written rules that are accepted by all people living together in a country. Constitution is the supreme law that determines the relationship among people living in a territory and also the relationship between the people and government. A constitution does many things. It generates a degree of trust and coordination that is necessary for different kind of people to live together. It specifies how the government will be constituted, who will have power to take which decisions. It lays down limits on the powers of the government and tells us what the rights of the citizens are. It expresses the aspirations of the people about creating a good society. All countries that have constitutions are not necessarily democratic, but all countries that are democratic will have constitutions. Constitution means a set of written rules. After the War of Independence against Great Britain, Americans gave themselves a constitution. After the revolution, the French people approved a democratic constitution. Since then, it has become a practice in all democracies to have a written constitution. Okay, now let us know about the making of the Indian constitution. The making of the constitution for a huge and diverse country like India was not an easy affair. At that time, the people of India were emerging from the status of subjects to that of citizens. The country was born through a partition on the basis of religious differences. This was a traumatic experience for the people of India and Pakistan. At least 10 lakh people were killed on both sides of the border in partition related violence. There was another problem. The British had left it to the rulers of the princely states to decide whether they wanted to merge with India or with Pakistan or remain independent. The merger of these princely states was a difficult and uncertain task. When the constitution was being written, the future of the country did not look as secure as it does today. The makers of the constitution had anxieties about the present and the future of the country. The rulers of Indian constitution had the advantage that they did not have to create a consensus about what a democratic India should look like, as it had already emerged during the freedom struggle. The Indian freedom struggle was also a struggle to rejuvenate our country and to transform our society and politics. There were sharp differences of opinion within the freedom struggle about the path India should take after independence. Such differences exist even today. Yet, some basic ideas had come to be accepted by almost everyone. As far back as in 1928, Motilal Nehru and 8 other Congress leaders drafted a constitution for India. In 1931, the resolution at the Karachi session of the Indian National Congress dwelt on how independent India's constitution should look like. Both these documents were committed to the inclusion of universal adult franchise, right to freedom and equality, and to protecting the rights of minorities in the Constitution of Independent India. Thus, some basic values were accepted by all leaders much before the Constituent Assembly met to deliberate on the Constitution. The familiarity with political institutions of colonial rule also helped develop an agreement over the institutional design. The British rule had given voting rights only to a few. On that basis, the British had introduced very weak legislatures. Elections were held in 1937 to provincial legislatures and ministries all over British India. These were not fully democratic governments, but the experience gained by Indians in the working of the legislative institutions proved to be very useful for the country in setting up its own institutions and working in them. That is why the Indian Constitution adopted many institutional details and procedures from colonial laws like the Government of India Act 1935. Years of thinking and deliberation on the framework of the Constitution had another benefit. Our leaders gained confidence to learn from other countries but on our own terms. Many of our leaders were inspired by the ideals of French Revolution, the practice of parliamentary democracy in Britain, and the Bill of Rights in the US. The socialist revolution in Russia had inspired many Indians to think of shaping a system based on social and economic equality. Yet they were not simply imitating what others had done. At each step, they were questioning whether these things suited our country. All these factors contributed to the making of our Constitution.